Welcome to today's session about the new rule applicable to certain Canadian issuers, National Instrument 52-12, Non-GAAP, and other financial measures disclosure. We have organized some short BigNet webinars as we have been getting questions on this new rule. We thought it would be beneficial to hold some short sessions, only 15 to 20 minutes in length, and go through some of these questions received. This is the second of 3 sessions we have scheduled, and this session focuses on frequently asked questions on total of segment measures. Before we start today's session, I have included our standard disclaimer that the views expressed today are our own and not necessarily representative of the ASC or the CSA. Let's start off with the total of segments measure definition. The first important item to highlight is the fact that only financial metrics and those financial metrics that are disclosed are in scope. So if a metric is identified only by label without a corresponding numerical amount, then this metric has not been disclosed and is not subject to 52-12. Also, if the metric is non-financial, such as production, number of rigs, or share information, then this non-financial metric is also not subject to 52-12. In paragraph A, for the measure to be a total of segments measure, it must be a subtotal or total of 2 or more reportable segments. And this subtotal or total of 2 or more reportable segments cannot be a component of a financial statement line item. For both paragraphs A and B of the total of segments measure definition, we have a few examples that we will go through in today's webinar. For paragraph C, it is a measure that is disclosed in the financial statements, but it is not a measure that comes from the primary financial statements. Lastly, to be a total of segments measure, all 4 paragraphs of the definition must be met. Starting off with a few examples. On the left of this slide, there's an excerpt from a reportable segment financial statement note. An individual segment measure that is disclosed in the financial statement notes is not captured under paragraph A, the total of segments measure definition, as it is not a total of 2 or more reportable segments. But the corporate total EBITDA of $4,950 is a measure that would be captured as a total of segments measure when it is disclosed outside of the financial statements. One question we have been getting is if an individual reportable segment is captured as a total of segments measure, if the individual reportable segment itself is made up of 2 or more operating segments which are aggregated into a single reportable segment. The answer is no, but let's walk through an example to demonstrate this. The Canadian reportable segment is made up of 3 operating segments that are aggregated to form the one Canadian reportable segment. Even though there are 3 operating segments that make up the one Canadian reportable segment, this individual Canadian reportable segment is not captured as a total of segments measure because it is not a total of 2 or more reportable segments. This individual Canadian reportable segment is simply the aggregation of 2 or more operating segments. But if EBITDA for one of the 3 aggregated operating segments is separately reported in the issuer's MD&A, then some disclosures are required under 52-12. I have an example of this later on, starting on slide 10. For paragraphs B and D of the total of segments measure definition, I have an example of information that has been disclosed outside of the financial statements in the table on the right. As you can see, total revenue is disaggregated into the individual revenues for products A, B, and C. And because total revenues is an amount from the primary financial statements, it does not meet paragraph D of the total of segments measure definition. The same for the revenues disclosed for each product A, B, and C. This would not be captured as a total of segments measure as it is a disaggregation, otherwise known as a component of the revenue financial statement line item. And these components have been calculated in accordance with the accounting policies used to prepare the revenue financial statement line item. Moving on to some examples of what are or what are not considered to be total segments measures. On the left, I have the same excerpt from the reportable segments financial statement note. On the slides that follow, I will go through the three different measures presented on this slide. 1, EBITDA of $19.50 for the individual Canadian segment. 2, EBITDA of $2,500 for the total of the two US segments. And 3, EBITDA of $49.50 for the corporate total. On this slide, for each measure, I will go through each paragraph of the total of segments measure definition to see if it meets the conditions. I will start with the most obvious measure, the corporate total EBITDA of $49.50 in the last column on the right. This measure meets all of the conditions of the total of segments measure definition. 1, it is the total of two or more reportable segments. EBITDA has not been disclosed in the primary financial statements, and corporate total EBITDA of $49.50 is disclosed in the reportable segments financial statement note. One aspect that we continue to get questions on is paragraph B, and whether EBITDA, which is net income less interest, taxes, depreciation, and amortization, and whether this EBITDA measure is a component as it is calculated from various financial statement line items making up net income. The answer is no. EBITDA is not a component of a financial statement line item. It is made up of net income adjusted by multiple financial statement line items. In order to be a component, the measure has to be a component of one individual financial statement line item, similar to the example provided on 6, which is the disaggregation of revenues. Moving on to the next measure, the Canadian segment EBITDA of $19.50 in the first column. This individual segment is not a total of segments measure, as it is not a total of two or more reportable segments. For the next measure, the total of the two US reportable segments, EBITDA of $2,500. Although this measure is a total of two reportable segments, the EBITDA measure itself of $2,500 has not been specifically disclosed in the financial statement notes. As such, this measure would not be a total of segments measure. Although the individual Canadian reportable segment and the total of the two US reportable segments are not total of segment measures, we need to look at each of these measures to see if they meet the definition of a non-GAAP financial measure. Let's flip back to the measures first as a reminder. Both the individual Canadian reportable segment measure of $19.50 and the total of the two US reportable segments EBITDA measure of $2,500 are not total of segment measures. Let's see if either of these measures are non-GAAP financial measures. On this slide, for each measure, I will go through each paragraph of the non-GAAP financial measure definition to see if it meets the conditions. The individual segment EBITDA measure of $19.50 does not meet the definition of a non-GAAP financial measure, as this measure has been disclosed in the reportable segment financial statement note. For the total of the two US reportable segments, EBITDA of $2,500, as we just walked through, this measure does not meet the definition of a total of segments measure, as it is not disclosed in the financial statement notes. However, this measure does meet the definition of a non-GAAP financial measure and is subject to the disclosure requirements in Section 6 of 52-12. Some of the key non-GAAP financial measure disclosure requirements in Section 6 include prominence and quantitative reconciliation, the same requirements that are also found in Section 9 for total of segment measures. But there are a total of 10 disclosure attributes for non-GAAP financial measures in Section 6 of 52-12 versus only 4 disclosure attributes for total of segment measures. So if your measure falls under the non-GAAP financial measure category, you may need to reassess to see if you have provided all of the relevant and necessary disclosures for the category of measure that you have disclosed. For the last example, the corporate total EBITDA of $49.50, we saw on slide 8 that this is a total of segment measure. And this measure does not meet the definition of a non-GAAP financial measure, as the $49.50 is disclosed in the reportable segment financial statement note. For our next example, again, on the left, we have an excerpt from the reportable segment financial statement note. On the right, we have financial information that is disclosed outside of the financial statements. In Table 1, EBITDA information is presented for products A, B, and C for each reportable segment. In Table 2, EBITDA information is presented for each of the aggregated Canadian operating segments, which make up the EBITDA for the individual Canadian reportable segment. On the slides that follow, I will go through the 3 different measures presented on this slide. 1, EBITDA of $600 for product A for the US East and Central reportable segment. 2, EBITDA of $14.46 for product C for the total of all of the 4 reportable segments. And 3, EBITDA of $650 for the Canadian operating segment number 1. Again, on this slide, for each of the measures, I will go through each paragraph of the total segments definition to see if it meets the conditions. For the Canadian operating segment number 1, which is one of the 3 operating segments aggregated to form the one Canadian reportable segment, this operating segment measure does not meet the definition of a total of segments measure, as it is not a total of 2 or more reportable segments. Also, the condition that the measure be disclosed in the financial statement notes has not been met, as the EBITDA of $650 for the Canadian operating segment number 1 is only disclosed in the MD&A and is not disclosed in the financial statement notes. For the next measure, EBITDA of $600 for product A for the US East and Central reportable segment, this is also not a total of segments measure, not meeting paragraphs A and C of the definition. Given it is not a total of 2 or more reportable segments in paragraph A, and revenue for product A for the US East and Central reportable segment is not specifically disclosed in the financial statement notes, not meeting paragraph B of this definition. For the last measure, EBITDA for product C for the total of all 4 reportable segments. Although this is a total of 2 or more reportable segments, the total EBITDA for product C has not been specifically disclosed in the financial statement notes. As such, it does not meet paragraph C of the total of segments measure definition. As you can see on this slide, each of these measures are not total of segments. But we need to look at the non-GAAP financial measure definition to see if any of these measures fall under that category. But first, let's revisit the measures as a refresher. We are looking at the 3 different measures on this slide. None of the measures are disclosed in the financial statements, and they are only disclosed outside of the financial statements. 1, EBITDA $650 for the Canadian operating segment number 1. 2, EBITDA of $600 for product A for the US East and Central reportable segment. And 3, EBITDA of $14.46 for the corporate total EBITDA for product C. And as we've just walked through, each of these measures are not total of segment measures. With each of these measures in mind, let's see if any of them meet the conditions in the non-GAAP financial measure definition. As you can see on this slide, each measure meets the definition of a non-GAAP financial measure and is subject to the disclosure requirements in Section 6. That covers off the 52 and 12 frequently asked questions presentation for today. If you have any questions on today's session or any other questions, do not hesitate to reach out to the Office of the Chief Accountant at the ASC. Our contact information is on this slide. Thank you so much for attending today's session. We have 2 other 52-112 webinars available for viewing right now. A link to each of these sessions is posted on the ASC website. If you have any ideas for any other sessions, or if you have any questions on some specific areas in 52-112 that we have not covered off today, or if you think another session would be helpful, do not hesitate to contact us. Thank you so much.